Hello everyone, welcome back to my study here in Sydney. As you can see, it's quite a grey and rainy day today. I've got my candle on, quite an atmospheric vibe today, and my thoughts have wandered back, as they often do, to April and May 1536, and I've been thinking about Anne Boleyn. Now, what I wanted to do is share with you a section of my book. I wanted to do a very short reading from my book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn. This is actually, excitingly, the newly released paperback edition of the book. So I only just received that yesterday, so it's really lovely to see it in its new form. And I wanted to read to you a particular section that relates to the weekend of the 29th and the 30th of April. Now, Anne Boleyn enthusiasts will know that this is not a good weekend for Anne and her supporters. In fact, what happens over this weekend pretty much seals her fate and those of the men accused alongside her. But before I read from my book, I did want to just bring you up to date on what is happening at court around this time. And I'm not going to go into any detail because I do want to focus on the events of that weekend. But as many Anne Boleyn enthusiasts will know, in January 1536, of course, Catherine of Aragon dies. Now, this may initially look like something good for Anne. She's finally the only Queen of England. Up until that point, of course, there'd been two. But this is not the case, and Anne realizes that this leaves her in an incredibly vulnerable position. Catherine of Aragon was essentially Anne's safety net, but she's now gone, and things are about to become very tense with her and Henry. Not long after Catherine's death, Henry has an accident while he's doing a training activity in the tilt yard. This Anne Boleyn herself claims caused her to miscarry her baby, which according to a couple of sources, she was around 15 weeks pregnant at the time. Now, Anne says that it was the shock of hearing about the king's accident that led her to have her miscarriage. I theorize in my book that it was a long miscarriage and happened over a number of days, and I base this on the primary documentation that survives. But it happened towards the end of January 1536. Of course, this is a tragic loss for Anne and Henry. Henry essentially abandons Anne and leaves her for a time to recover on her own. In February 1536, we have the first mention of Jane Seymour in association with the king. So the king, according to the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, is giving her lots of gifts and paying her special attention. Now, I want to fast forward to April 1536 and just touch on some events that happen just before the weekend of the 29th and 30th of April. So on Monday, the 24th of April, two commissions, Voyer and Terminer, are set up at Westminster. Now, these are set up to investigate unspecified treasons that have taken place in the counties of Kent and Middlesex. Now, I need to stress that these commissions do not mention Anne by name or any of the men that will be accused alongside her. Some historians have suggested that this doesn't have anything to do with the case against Anne. I disagree. I think this is the king's first official move against his wife. Now, of course, Anne is being kept completely in the dark. On the surface, everything seems okay. She's still Queen of England. Henry is still referring to her as his beloved wife in dispatches to European rulers, in his letters. But Anne is incredibly intelligent and perceptive, and she has picked up that something is not right. She understands that her stability, her safety relies on Henry. She needs Henry. That's the nature of their relationship, and it always has been. So she is sufficiently concerned about what is going on to reach out to her chaplain, Matthew Parker, on Wednesday, the 26th of April. Now, we don't know exactly what takes place during this conversation, but what we do know is that Matthew never forgot that moment with Queen Anne. He remembered it well into Elizabeth's reign, and in fact, we know that Anne reached out to him because he mentions this during Elizabeth's reign, and he also writes a letter to Lord Burleigh to say if it wasn't for his loyalty for Anne, he probably wouldn't have served Elizabeth as Archbishop of Canterbury. So we know that he had a close relationship with Anne. They were both from Norfolk, and they clearly had a strong connection. So it's likely that Anne entrusted Elizabeth's care to Matthew Parker. At this stage, I don't think Anne could have imagined that she would end up on the scaffold, executed, but I think she certainly knew the king well enough to know that he could banish her from court, he could possibly lock her up in a nunnery somewhere, and she would never see Elizabeth again. So she is concerned enough by what she's sensing around her to reach out to him. Now, at this point at court, there is an atmosphere of secrecy and suspicion. What happens next is a very bad sign for Anne. Parliament is suddenly summoned. Now, this comes just a fortnight after the Reformation Parliament had been dissolved. So it's clear that it has been established to deal with the legal ramifications of Anne's fall, although of course she doesn't know that yet. Now, the same day as Parliament is summoned, the Bishop of London is actually approached to see if Henry can abandon Anne. Now, we don't know if this line of questioning has come from the king, but it appears that it has. And what it tells us is that at this point, the Crown had nothing substantial against Anne. They had nothing to base their case on. But this, I'm afraid, is all about to change. Now, I would like to read you a section of my book. As the net closed around the Queen, her characteristically sharp mind became jittery and clouded by fear. Her frayed nerves caused her to talk unguardedly and lash out in anger at those around her. On Saturday, the 29th of April, she found the court musician Mark Smeaton in her presence chamber looking despondent. When Anne asked him why he looked so sad, Smeaton responded that it was no matter. The Queen, in no mood for games, said reprovingly, "You may not look to have me speak to you as I should do to a nobleman, because ye be an inferior person." To this, Smeaton answered, "A look sufficeth me, and thus fare you well." Greg Walker suggests that this incident demonstrates that Smeaton harboured amorous feelings for the Queen, and that he may have even seen himself as one of her courtly suitors. This would explain why the Queen made a point of putting him in his place. Anne's continental education ensured she was well versed in the rhetoric and conventions of courtly love. As Queen, Anne was required to demonstrate the ideals of womanly behaviour, such as submissiveness and chastity, while simultaneously playing a central role in the culture of courtly love, which involved much flirtatious repartee. Anne struggled with treading the tightrope of these contradictory gender roles, which proved instrumental in her downfall. While it was commonplace for the high-ranking men who surrounded the Queen to shower her with compliments and praise her beauty and virtues in sonnets and ballads, she needed to remain distant and appear at all times unattainable. But even someone of Anne's calibre could make mistakes while navigating this precarious balancing act. Later the same day, or early Sunday morning, Anne accused Sir Henry Norris, a Boleyn supporter and her husband's groom of the stool, of delaying his marriage to her cousin and lady-in-waiting because he wanted to marry her instead. "You look for dead men's shoes," spat the Queen recklessly, "for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." A dismayed Norris vowed that if he should have any such thought, he would his head were off. His response only further incensed the Queen, who warned Norris that she could undo him if she wanted to. No sooner had the words escaped her mouth than sanity returned. Aware that she'd crossed a dangerous line, Anne later ordered Norris to go to her almoner and swear that she was a good woman. But in a court where ears pricked at the slightest impropriety, the damage was instantaneous and irreparable. For according to the 1534 Treason Act, simply imagining the king's death was high treason. Hence, the Queen had unwittingly handed her enemies the the means with which to destroy her. Courtiers carried whispers of Anne and Norris's falling out down the Privy Palace's gallery. It wasn't long before these words found the king's suspicious ear. This almost certainly explains what happened next. According to the Scottish theologian Alexander Ales, who had been at court on Sunday, the 30th of April, he witnessed a heated confrontation between Anne and Henry. In a letter sent to Elizabeth in September 1559, he recounted what he had seen. "Never shall I forget the sorrow which I felt when I saw the most serene queen, your most religious mother, carrying you, still a little baby, in her arms and entreating the most serene king, your father, in Greenwich Palace, from the open window of which he was looking into the courtyard when she brought you to him. I did not perfectly understand what had been going on, but the faces and gestures of the speakers plainly showed that the king was angry, although he could conceal his anger wonderfully well. Yet from the protracted conference of the council, for whom the crowd was waiting until it was quite dark, expecting that they would return to London, it was most obvious to everyone that some deep and difficult question was being discussed. The king's anger and Anne's desperation were almost certainly sparked by the earlier incident with Sir Henry Norris. The situation was sufficiently serious to warrant the postponement of the royal couple's upcoming trip. Henry announced that he would be travelling to Dover the following week instead. As the new instructions contained no mention of Anne, one presumes that he intended on travelling alone. The decision, according to Thomas Worley, was made at 11 o'clock at night on Sunday, the 30th of April. Whether or not Anne was immediately informed is uncertain. It's also unclear as to whether the Queen noticed that Mark Smeaton was missing from court. At some point following his encounter with the Queen, the young musician was seized, presumably on Henry's orders, and taken to a house in Stepney for questioning. He must have shuddered when he realised that it was the home of Thomas Cromwell, and that the great man would be personally handling the interrogation. Imagine the broad smile that must have worked its way across the minister's face as he heard about the exchange between Anne and the musician. Unlike Sir Henry Norris, who was well born and a seasoned courtier in his early 50s, Smeaton was probably only in his mid-20s and a commoner at that. This made him wretchedly vulnerable and particularly susceptible to intimidation. If convicted of high treason, he would be hung, drawn, and quartered, unless the king commuted the sentence to beheading. It's hardly surprising then that within hours of being detained, Smeaton had confessed to having committed adultery with the Queen.